what has changed, at least in the last year, is the level of politics and rancor and tumult that we've gone through. It has been a time like no other. I will say it's very, very good for education journalism. It has made my business. But beyond me, I wanted to pose out to the question to the panel of whether this politics, this front page news, the rancor back and forth is good for schools. Is it bad for schools? Is it dangerous? Are you indifferent? And I thought this would be a good question to start with Brett Schundler, who sort of had to go through this in the last year and get his thoughts on whether this has been a good time for schools to get these issues on the table, or potentially a destructive one, or one in between.
There's an awful lot of questions that can be taken in different ways there, but I'll just interpret the questions the way I feel like, and be able to say whatever I feel like, which is wonderful.
That's beautiful.
But the bottom line is, if you have a politically controlled system, you're going to have politics. Now, I had a small business before I became the chief operating officer of the King's College. There was no politics in the management of that business. There were no profits either, I'll have you know. But there was no politics. It was a market-based system. You could make your decisions. You either thrived or you didn't thrive by virtue of having chosen well what business you wanted to be in and managing it well. But we have a government public school system, and you're going to have political control, and you're going to have politics in that system. Now, the politics, when it's not in the front pages of the newspaper, will lend itself towards interest groups which are politically active, that have interests that are valid, but they're not universal. They're not let's say the interests of everyone. They're the interests of the group. And what will happen is there will still be politics, but it will be a politics that is not necessarily discussed much on the front pages of the newspaper, and doesn't necessarily advance the cause of the public interest. Now, that is going to be there. It's going to always be there. It's an institutional reality that can't be changed. The only way, if you will, to have decisions made politically that are in the interest of the public is to have those issues on the front page of the newspaper in a way that engages the public and creates a countervailing force to the power of interest groups. Now, with that said, that kind of attention is necessary but not sufficient for the politics to result in good decisions being made. You can be in the front page of the newspaper and still have lots of lousy decisions made. But you will never have really good decisions made that result in the system serving the broader public interest unless the public is out there fighting for its interests. And that goes to say that politics is very important, and we have the potential now, because of how education has increased as a political issue. There is the potential for positive reforms to be made. And I'll just go back. Many of you heard when I was first appointed, I commented on the fact that I thought there was an incredible degree of agreement between the Democratic leadership in the legislature and myself and President Obama and Governor Christie that made it possible to implement a lot of long overdue reforms. And without this issue having become politically ripe, it would not have been possible. Now, that's not to say that the opportunities are being seized well. And if there's any disappointment, it may be that sometimes you have the moment where the public is engaged and you can really get good reforms implemented, but you fumble that opportunity, to mix metaphors, because of, let's say, those who have the opportunity don't seize it well.
Are we at a point like that right now? I guess I have to ask that follow-up question. You've stepped away from it. Are these opportunities being seized, in your view?
Well, Vito commented on, let's say, lack of capacity. We are having a problem with the department. I think everyone is quite aware that we don't have many of our leadership positions filled. So that right there is an example of an opportunity where we are not building the capacity to seize it. I would also argue, I think there was an awful lot of ability to have the legislative leadership and the executive branch work cooperatively, but I think if you will, the common view on some of the reforms that needed to get done, that's, unfortunately, there's been enough acrimony that perhaps didn't need to be there, to where you now have some legislators who, even if they agree with legislators on the other side of the aisle or with the executive branch, they don't want to see the other side get credit for getting something done. So they won't support, initiative because it could accrue to the political benefit of the other side. And there again is, let's say missed opportunities when you have people who agree with what needs to be done, but rather than allowing the public's engagement with the issue to give them the protection they need to implement long overdue reforms by coming together across party lines, they let themselves fall into bickering and, if you will, getting short-term political gains at the other expense. And what ultimately happens is the reform moment is lost.
Bill, do you want to weigh? I'm sure it wasn't all kumbaya when you were commissioner.
Oh, yes, it was. Oh, yes, it was.
Speak to this a little.
I think Brett has offered what I think is a magnanimous view of the political arrangement, and I would respectfully disagree because I think it is worse than he described. And I think it's worse than he described because there are economic forces that are now in existence that haven't been there before, in my lifetime anyway. And what they do is sharpen the political influence. And I think that what he did describe, I witnessed, which is people who would agree on the general intent of what you should do and almost never agree on the specific ways in which you could get there. And I think that it is incumbent upon us to try and find ways to reduce part of the political influence, part of it, if we can. But that's going to not come from the political arena. That's going to come from parents and teachers and those of us in this room to raise certain questions and to do certain things that I think would improve the degree of political influence. Now, I'll give you one example. I take the position that any funding formula that would come out of the process that we have in the state of New Jersey, with a lot of people being involved, people of goodwill, is better than no funding formula. And we have consistently over 20 years had funding formulas that we didn't apply. And so we end up with things that I think are the worst of all solutions, like across-the-board increases or across-the-board freezes and things like that. I think we should all advocate, among other things, for some funding formula. And we've had, I think, two that were very good. I thought CFA was a pretty good funding formula. I thought the work that John Corzine and his administration did was a pretty good funding formula. It would be much better if we said, or if constitutionally it was established, that whatever funding formula you have, you must use. What has to be decided is the proportion at which you can implement that. We could all live with that. But what is happening is the unbridled, ongoing political influence strangles a lot of the creativity, the energy, and I think puts us in forms of gridlock that don't serve the enterprise well.
Lucille, and at one point, bring your perspective also of having been in the governor's office before you became commissioner, and the role. Obviously, all of you were appointed by governors, and that's a change from our history. But speak to that influence and how that has affected the job. You think?
Well, I think the political influences make the job a lot harder, without a doubt. And I also think that politics in it can really hinder the commissioner's ability to get the job done. I appreciate what Brett said. I also think that the point that you made about it leading to gridlock when people don't want politically to see someone else win. I think it's what we're witnessing at the national level right now, too. And I think it's something that should concern all of us as Americans and as New Jerseyans. I think politics doesn't belong in education. I recognize that it's a part of it, whether we like it or not. I think as an education policy advisor, I always looked at myself as a policy person first. And I think there were times when people in the governor's office resented that I worried more about good policy than good politics. I think that sometimes happens to commissioners as well. People wish in the governor's office that you were more concerned about the politics of it than the policy. But I don't see how you can be an education leader and put politics first. I think you understand that you work in that arena. As an education advisor, I always used to try to advance the policy, figuring there were enough people that were going to advance the politics, and whether or not it was smart politically to follow one course of action or the other. I think the advantage that we had when Governor McGreevey was elected was that he was very committed from before he was elected to a policy platform that really did put children and their learning first. And when he hired Bill as commissioner, I think Bill went to the department to execute that very good policy. Bill, I don't think it took very long before politics got in the middle of some of that.
Not long, correct. We both know that.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
And have scars to emphasize it. Yes.
Absolutely, but I do think that it does depend on how the governor perceives it. I think. To his credit, I think Governor Corzine tried to put policy first, frankly, advancing a funding formula that some people thought was going to hurt the Abbott districts in particular. As a Democrat, was a very difficult decision and took, frankly, some political courage. In retrospect now, people who I think thought that wasn't a good idea are looking and saying, gee, it'd be good to have a funding formula that was actually funded. But the politics can sometimes get in the way of this, and so I think it's something that we have to be careful of. My other point, and I think this is one that I really feel strongly has to be made, people will commit to and support that which they help to create. And I think that means that educators have to be involved in the development of policy, educators at all levels, teachers, supervisors, principals, and superintendents. And I think that we sometimes lose sight of that. And I think we will never be successful in moving forward without having all of those folks at the table and without having them help us develop the solutions. I think all of us tried to do that during our term as commissioner. And at times you're more successful than others. But I really believe that educators have to be part of the solution. That doesn't mean that there aren't political interests, different kind of politics, among those groups. And that can sometimes get in the way too. But I really believe that educators need to be at the table helping to devise those solutions. I don't think we'll be successful in bringing about the kind of reform that has to be implemented if we don't do that.
John, may I?
Yeah, sure.
I believe that we all bring with us strong beliefs, whether it be about education, about politics, what have you. And I grew up in Jersey City in Hudson County, and I didn't know that there was a Republican Party until a teacher told me that Abe Lincoln was a Republican. Having said that, we moved forward in one of the courses that I took in the master's program. The professor put on the board, there is no room for politics in education. And I believed that. I did believe it. And the truth is that without politics, there isn't going to be any movement in education. It doesn't always have to be negative. If commissioners are now selected by governors, judges are somehow nominated by political leaders, Supreme Court justices, everybody becomes involved in the political system some way. Having said all of that, I believe that as a result of recent situations, and when I say recent, I mean within the last 6 months, and maybe I read the newspaper with a jaundiced eye, I thought for sure there were going to be a lot more people jumping on the bandwagon of name calling and pointing fingers at specific individuals because of how they were labeled as a result of someone's expression. And I noticed recently in the Star Ledger as well as in the Asbury Park Press that there have been a series of articles touting the positives about what's happening in the state of New Jersey, that we're leaders in certain areas. I'll pick out one, for instance. New Jersey, and has been for a long while, by the way, there are more 3- and 4-year-olds being educated in the state of New Jersey by certificated people than in any other state in the nation. I think that's terrific. I think we also are leaders. Also, we rank very highly on some of these god-awful tests that we subject our kids to. But when you have standards and proficiencies, we must have assessments. But having said all of that, with all the time and effort we put in our schools, we do very well. And I was so pleased to see that this most recent article in the last of the series in Asbury Park, that it was informing the readers that, yes, we need to improve on a whole lot. Yes, we are experiencing difficult financial problems statewide and as well as nationally. But I'm going to just jump on a couple of things that my colleagues have said.
And we're going to get to some of the specifics, too.
One last.
Okay.
When people who have youngsters involved in special ed programs find out that this 2% cap, this magical 2% cap on local school district budgets that isn't going to incorporate all the expenditures and increases in health benefits and salaries and so on. When they find out that special ed funding is part of that 2%, you're going to see a lot more action locally and statewide, and I think that's a good thing, politically.
There was our first news item of the night, a commissioner saying that the media is playing up the good news. So that's, I'm feeling
Well, there
good.
have been some
Feeling-
changes since you
feeling
left,
good about
John.
that.
Man bites dog.
Let's get into some of the.
John, can
You want to?
I would like my 10 seconds.
Okay, we'll give you 10.
I'm supposed to be next to Vito because I'm supposed to, like, just give me that sign.
Okay.
Just 10 seconds here, and there's a reality here, and the reality is called change. Change is messy if you're trying to make big changes happen. Change is going to need a political process for profound change to occur. Think of the change you want to accomplish as a huge boulder. And I've seen education reformers get tired just walking around this boulder, nevertheless trying to move it. Now, there's only one way you're going to move this, and that's you're going to have to take the biggest crowbar you can find to get the leverage, and it's going to be messy. You're going to step on some folks' toes, but so long as you're right, and it looks like we have a pretty solid evidence, at least from the federal and state policymakers together, that profound educational change must occur, and this is a big boulder. This is a huge educational system that change comes very tough to. You're going to have to take a huge crowbar, and that means it's going to be messy, and you're going to step on some folks' toes. So are we seeing the byproduct of a big change process? That remains to be seen.